Good morning and welcome to Rising. Our show was brought to you today by Blood, Sweat, and Tears. I took a little tumble on the way to the studio today, and I think my arm's okay, but we'll find out at the doctors later. So just
makes it seem like it's your fault, Robby.
I'm not blaming the other person. It was certainly mutual wrongdoing. I was just so excited to talk about the news today. I wasn't looking closely enough where I was going on my little scooter. So here we are.
Yes, Robby versus a car door. Persecution by your political opponents, Robby.
Indeed, more of this deep state malfeasance. Well, let's get to it while I'm still conscious and the painkillers are kicking in. We're just 10 weeks out from the election. Former President Donald Trump officially launching his transition team. Now, in a bold move, Trump has named two former Democrats, Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., as honorary co-chairs of the team. Meanwhile, the controversy surrounding Trump's recent Arlington Cemetery visit has quickly escalated after Trump posted this video of himself at the cemetery. Let's watch.
We lost 13 great people. What a horrible day it was. We didn't lose one person in 18 months. And then they took over that disaster, the leaving of Afghanistan.
Now, for anyone who missed it, this is what happened. Basically, Trump's team visited Arlington National Cemetery on Monday. He was invited there by the Gold Star families to commemorate the 3rd anniversary of the attack at the Kabul airport in Afghanistan that killed 13 U.S. service members. The problem is that federal law prohibits political campaign or election-related activities within the Army National Military cemeteries. That includes Arlington. A cemetery official reportedly told Trump's team that he could not come with campaign staff. After a cemetery employee tried to enforce the rules, a Trump campaign aide insisted the camera was allowed and pushed past the employee. The cemetery employee filed an incident report, but has declined to press charges. Military officials told the New York Times the employee feared Trump's supporters would retaliate against her if she did. The family of a Green Beret who is buried there has also since expressed concern about videos and photos taken by his grave. Now, meanwhile, the Trump campaign has insisted they had permission for the photographer. One Trump spokesman said in a statement, quote, "The fact is that a private photographer was permitted on the premises, and for whatever reason, an unnamed individual clearly suffering from a mental health episode decided to physically block members of President Trump's team during a very solemn ceremony." And this was what Trump's running mate, J.D. Vance, had to say about the whole controversy. Let's watch that.
Could you tell us more about the altercation that happened at the Arlington Cemetery?
Well, I think, first of all, the altercation at Arlington Cemetery is the media creating a story where I really don't think that there is one. There is verifiable evidence. There is verifiable evidence that the campaign was allowed to have a photographer there. There's verifiable, they were invited to have a photographer there. There's verifiable evidence that the families of these poor people who had their loved ones die 3 years ago at Abbey Road, Abbey Gate, those 13 Americans, a lot of them were there with the president. They invited him to be there and to support them. That's not an insult to the memories of their loved ones. They wanted Donald Trump there, and thank God that we have a president who stands with our veterans, but to have those 13 Americans lose their lives and not fire a single person is disgraceful. Kamala Harris is disgraceful. We're going to talk about a story out of those 13 brave, innocent Americans who lost their lives. It's that Kamala Harris is so asleep at the wheel that she won't even do an investigation into what happened, and she wants to yell at Donald Trump because he showed up. She can go to hell.
Strong words from J.D. Vance.
Go ahead, Robby.
I was just going to say strong words from J.D. Vance. What did you make of it, Jessica?
I think that blaming Kamala for a story that was not a story Kamala broke. She's not one of the reporters who covered this. It's not her saying it, but it definitely helps the JD Vance. Oh, this is just, the other side trying to make us look bad. But it really does sound like this was a violation of Section 80, that photographers, while maybe someone was permitted who was there to take pictures, he's saying there's verifiable evidence of it. I haven't seen that in any of the stories I've read about it. I don't know what they're referring to in regards to that, but that's very different from filming TikToks and posting. And so I think, yeah, if you're going to a wreath laying ceremony, this is not something that you use to make political media and really make a political point about the pulling out from Afghanistan. This is a wreath laying ceremony, and there's a reason for these restrictions on campaigning, filming, and photographing there. I think the altercation sounds like a terrible way to respond to someone who's there to protect, sacred ground where people are buried who laid their life on the line for the country. It sounds pretty bad what went down there. And the Trump campaign tried to make it so this didn't get out, that this altercation happened. And of course, she's afraid of Trump supporters retaliating. That's something they would absolutely do if she got in the way of something that was good for the campaign. So I honestly hope she does end up pressing charges so we can figure out what happened that day.
Yeah, look, the campaign has to follow whatever the rules are. Mutually, all campaigns should have to. So if there's limitations on what kind of photography should be going on for campaign reasons or other reasons, that type of thing, then yeah, that was a screw up. And obviously, getting physical or roughing people up is always a bad look and a bad thing. So, I don't. Is it fair to blame Kamala Harris for it? No, of course not. So that was not a good strategy. And the Trump campaign, has to watch out for things like this, that, these are unforced errors. There's no reason they had to do this. I did want to talk about what we led the segment with. I think this is very interesting. Tulsi Gabbard, RFK Jr., both former Democrats, both people who have sought the presidency, not as Republicans, are now endorsing and supporting and would be part of the transition team if he wins, of Donald Trump. This is part of the argument Republicans are going to make, that the Republican Party is the big tent party, is the home not just for conservatives, but for disaffected liberals and progressives, for the Kennedy name, the name that for 50 years was more associated with the Democratic Party than any other dynasty, now a prominent member endorsing the Republican president. Tulsi Gabbard, someone who was seen as a very promising, up-and-coming, a veteran woman, progressive Bernie Sanders supporter, appealed to the mainstream media for a time because of her identity-based reasons, and is now, persona non grata on the left, in the media, on the Democratic side, because she, dissents from some of their orthodoxies over the years on foreign policy and COVID and social issues, et cetera, now part of the GOP. I think as the Democratic Party continues to make unwelcome people who do not automatically fall in line with the elite consensus, there are going to be more defectors in this vein.
Yeah, Bernie Sanders, the biggest example of someone who doesn't fall in line with the elite consensus of the Democratic Party, still sees a home in the Democratic Party, sees their vision as more aligned with what's needed to stand up to the wealthy people in the country and have an economy that works for working people. These are not things that Tulsi Gabbard or RFK Jr. ever ran on. So to me, their exit of the Democratic Party is welcome. RFK Jr. himself, spoke a lot about how he wasn't going to stand up to America's biggest corporations. Tulsi Gabbard never laid out a meaningful economic vision for the working class. So as far as I'm concerned, they left the Democratic Party long before they ever endorsed Trump. They were already more aligned with Donald Trump than they ever were with the Democrats. So it just makes sense to me. I think a lot of them are emoting because they're upset that Democrats had, lawsuits against RFK Jr., lawsuits that I disagree with, but I still see this as a response, sort of in bitterness from both Tulsi Gabbard and RFK Jr., because they had failed campaigns and they see the Democrats as, not being welcome to them. RFK Jr., there's reporting, was in talks with the Kamala Harris campaign. They were not interested in having him be a part of the administration. That's what he wanted in exchange for dropping out. And so I think these are two candidates who feel rejected by the party. So they were welcomed in the other in an effort to get their voters, to get their supporters. But Tulsi Gabbard's been doing Fox News hits since like early 2021. So I'm not surprised that either of them have dropped out and supported Trump. I don't think they're bringing anyone with them that wasn't already out of the Democratic Party.
We shall see. More rising right after this.
Robby, what is on your radar?
Well, Jessica, Meta CEO Mark Zuckerberg has now admitted publicly that moderators at Facebook and Instagram faced vast pressure from the federal government to take down contrarian COVID-19 content, election-related content, including jokes and satire, as well as the New York Post's Hunter Biden laptop story. This led the platforms to make moderation decisions that Zuckerberg now regrets. I believe the government pressure was wrong, and I regret that we were not more outspoken about it, wrote Zuckerberg in a letter to the House Judiciary Committee, which is investigating suppression of speech on social media. We're ready to push back if something like this happens again. That's what he said. This is a welcome development, although not everybody who previously complained about the company's moderation policies is happy about it. Venture capitalist Eric Weinstein, for instance, opined that Zuckerberg's wealth should be distributed to those he targeted and wronged as recompense for what occurred under his watch. That's some serious victim blaming, in my opinion. Zuckerberg's critics like to pretend that standing up to the federal government would have been an easy choice. Obviously, it wasn't. President Joe Biden accused Facebook of killing people. Remember that? And he implied that he would call for congressional action to punish the company if it did not fall in line. Let's watch.
COVID misinformation. On COVID misinformation, what's your message to platforms like Facebook?
They're killing people. I mean, it really, look, the only pandemic we have is among the unvaccinated. And they're killing people.
Love that anachronistic pandemic of the unvaccinated. How did that work out? In any case, Kate Bedingfield, who was a member of Biden's communications team, explicitly told MSNBC that the administration would target Meta's Section 230 protection if the platform did not heed the government's requests. Now, it wasn't as if Republicans had been offering incentives for Zuckerberg and other tech CEOs to act bravely. They weren't lining up to defend them. On the contrary, many in the GOP were just as eager to abolish Section 230 as their Democratic counterparts. Former President Donald Trump, current Republican vice presidential candidate J.D. Vance, Senator Josh Hawley, many others have all inveighed against this law. And I say this is foolishness. Now, as a reminder of what Section 230 is, it's the federal statute that makes social media possible. Enacted in 1996 as part of the Communications Decency Act, the law establishes that internet websites are not, generally speaking, liable for third-party generated content. In a nutshell, this means that if a user writes something libelous on Facebook, that person can be sued. Facebook cannot be sued. It's impossible to overstate the importance of this legal protection. If websites were held liable for all content, they would become significantly more restrictive. It's no surprise then that prominent Democrats universally in support of removing Section 230 protection. They think social media companies do not moderate enough content and that more ought to be done to curb so-called hate speech and misinformation. They correctly surmise that one way to encourage even more heavy-handed moderation would be to eliminate Section 230, thus stripping social media sites of their protection from frivolous lawsuits. Democrats understand that the rise of social media has been a positive development for conservative, independent, libertarian, contrarian, and alternative media ecosystems. The swiftest way to destroy these ecosystems will be to deprive the platforms of their legal shield. That's why the threats from the Biden administration were so very serious. For Meta, X, Google, and other tech giants, there was a very real possibility that censorship-minded Democrats and misguided tech-phobic Republicans would come together and approve federal legislation to punish social media sites. Many in the GOP were perfectly willing to abandon free market principles, join with Democrats in going after Zuckerberg. So is it any surprise then that Meta, lacking allies, was reluctant to tell the feds to buzz off? Meanwhile, the worst reaction to Zuckerberg's letter came courtesy of, you guessed it, CNN, which headlined the news write-up of the development in this manner: Mark Zuckerberg's election season gift to Republicans. The article continues, Mark Zuckerberg is handing Republicans political victories ahead of the 2024 presidential election, acquiescing to years of GOP grievances over his company's policies. That's according to CNN's John Passantino, a deputy managing editor. According to that article's framing, the federal pressure campaign directed at Zuckerberg was not the real problem. The real problem was Zuckerberg revealed the existence of the pressure campaign. He said the quiet part out loud. Passantino seems to suggest that it was bad to expose efforts by federal bureaucrats to browbeat social media companies into removing provocative content. He writes, quote, the letter was immediately weaponized by Trump. Oh no, not that. If Zuckerberg's letter is a potent weapon for Republicans, perhaps the Biden administration deserves some blame for equipping them with it. They didn't have to do that. Incessantly pestering social media companies in a manner that raises fundamental First Amendment questions was a choice, and it was a bad one. And I think it's telling that CNN has little to say about that, would rather complain that Zuckerberg, at long last, has had enough and is speaking out. Gift to Republicans indeed. So I thought the framing of that article was just totally wrong. It shows the limited way CNN and other mainstream outlets think that, like, here's an important development where the CEO of the company admits that there was vast censorship that occurred on the platform that he regrets, that was motivated by the information he got from the feds that he would not do again. That's a huge story. It confirms a lot of what we have reported on our show, what friends of the show like Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberger have reported on. The paranoia about the federal overreach justified. CNN doesn't think that's the story. The story is, well, Republicans are going to pounce. Republicans are going to use this to benefit themselves. Well, is it a legitimate thing for them to be mad about? Yes, it is.
Yeah, I think it's a poison in our society that any news is looked at. Who is this good for? The right or the left? Democrats or Republicans? Trump or Kamala Harris? Instead of just what is good for society. Is this bad? Should people in power fix this? Should people in power be doing this? And it reminds me of TikTok. And I think that a big reason TikTok became the target of Congress and the government to ban is because it's very likely they wouldn't play ball when it came to censorship. And I think it's really telling that leaders of the ADL were caught on a leaked audio saying we have a TikTok problem in reference to how many pro-Palestine posts were on the app and how they outnumbered posts that were in defense of what the IDF was doing in Gaza. And so at the end of the day, if the government has a particular narrative they want to push, and they're willing to label anything that's unfavorable to the US position as un-American or disinformation or misinformation, that's a really scary place to be in politically. And it's bad when Republicans do it. Republican administrations, I'm sure, did this under 9/11. Democratic administrations have done this under COVID-19. And I'm sure in some years we're going to see some evidence as to what this looked like around the US support of Israel. So it's very scary that the solution was just to get rid of TikTok. It's good Mark Zuckerberg is speaking up about this and saying we've got to change how we do it. How this happened was wrong.
Yes, indeed. All right, we'll be back with more Rising right after this. Home prices hit a record high in June. Prices rose 5.4% nationally in June compared to the previous year, according to the S&P CoreLogic Case-Shiller Index. The increase comes amid an ongoing housing shortage as high mortgage rates continue. The nation's housing deficit rose to 4.5 million in 2022, up from 4.3 million in 2021, per Zillow. Vice President Kamala Harris has tried to calm Americans, tweeting, quote, even if aspiring homeowners save for years, it's often still not enough. My administration will provide first-time home buyers with $25,000 to help with the down payments on a new home. To which Elon Musk responded, quote, unless you increase the supply of new homes, this just raises the price by $25K and does nothing for affordability.
Now, for many in the Black community, affordable housing has been a struggle with roots in inequitable policies. Federal policies in the 1930s created segregated communities with negative ripple effects still being felt today. The practice is commonly known as redlining, which targeted specific neighborhoods that would receive little or no government investment. These maps were based almost entirely on race. which led to a surge in predatory loans and unaffordable housing. Joining us now to discuss the latest in housing is author of Know Your Price, Valuing Black Lives and Property in America's Black Cities. And he's also the director of Brookings Center for Community Uplift and a professor of Practice of Economics at Washington University. Andre Perry, thank you for coming on the show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So what we're experiencing right now over the past few years, we've seen investors make up about 30% of purchasing. How much of this is a true lack of supply when we have so many vacant units and vacant homes, but we're really seeing investors come in a predatory way, sometimes artificially raising the prices, making homes unaffordable? How much of this is more so driven by investor demand?
Well, a lot of my research looks at housing devaluation. In 2018, we measured the value of homes in Black communities compared to their white counterparts. And what we found is that homes in Black communities, and that's after controlling for education, crime, walkability, all those fancy Zillow metrics, we found that homes in Black communities are still underpriced by 23%, about $48,000 per home, cumulatively at about $156 billion in lost equity. But what that means is that you're getting a discount essentially in a Black neighborhood when you purchase a home. Investors know this, home buyers know this, and so they seek out to purchase homes in Black neighborhoods because when there's constrained supply, you go where homes are affordable. And right now, everyone's looking to Black neighborhoods, the neighborhoods that are close to the core of the city, and it's increasing demand. And then as soon as some of those homes are purchased, they rent or sell to a different demographic and raise the prices. So we colloquially we hear that is gentrification, but it's not hard to see the basic principles of supply and demand at play. There's simply not enough homes in many neighborhoods across the U.S.
Well, and if there aren't enough homes, then, my question, what good is giving $25,000 to first-time home buyers? I mean, that's subsidizing demand. That's going to raise the demand for the limited, too limited, I would argue, a supply of housing, artificially limited by restrictions on development, NIMBY type stuff, the preference for single family dwelling units rather than large buildings with multifamily units. That kind of stuff is my preferred solution for increasing the housing supply and easing the housing tensions.
Well, you need both, and I think there are many programs currently out there that will allow to provide first-time home buyers and home buyers in general relief. We have special purpose credit programs that can be applied to reduce the amount of down payment used. So that's a tool. I think the point is you need both. You need to increase supply, and if there's an order to it, you want to increase supply first. But you also need to provide some relief, because how discrimination shows up over time is a lack of down payment. A person's grandfather who could not own a home because of discrimination could not pass down that intergenerational wealth, and those families simply do not have enough down payment. So you do need both. I think in these debates right now, some people focus on the supply, some people focus on the down payment assistance. The correct way to look at it is you need both if you're going to increase home ownership equitably across the United States.
I see a lot of people focusing on the supply of homes in the U.S. We've seen that there were 680.9 outstanding listings in December of 2022. That figure was 734.3 thousand at the end of April 2024. So we are seeing net positive new homes added to the market. We are seeing existing homes for sale. And despite this increase and this above average reading of new homes for 8.3 months, much more than the regular 6-month norm, how are we seeing an increase of homes getting on the market, but we're still seeing prices going up? Like, are investors that make up 30% of home purchases crowding people out who would actually live in and use the homes that they're purchasing? Is this an affordability issue, or is it an
There's,
investor crowding
you know,
out
there are
families?
many things at play. Remember that when we look at these numbers, we often recite the numbers in the national aggregate. But housing markets are very specific. And so when you look at many of the hot housing markets, they are very constrained, largely by single family zoning ordinances and other restrictions that simply limit the amount of supply. And so any plan that moves forward, they're going to have to work with state and local housing authorities to change those sort of basic rules around how many units or what kind of homes you can put in a neighborhood, because there are many places that there's the space, and in some cases there's the inventory, but there's simply not an allowance for innovation in the housing markets to allow for condos and other ADUs and other ways to increase the amount of units in a place. So yes, we are increasing the number of homes, but in some areas it's simply too constrained, which leads to an increase in pricing.
So how do we square that in a place like San Francisco, where there's extreme housing constraints, but this is a city where in the city we're seeing 13 to 15% of homes vacant? I've seen a lot of these calculations done as, what's the amount of people typically purchasing homes in a generation based on previous, but we're not seeing incomes go up in a lot of these generations. Are you seeing, the lack of affordability driven by decreased incomes being a factor here?
Yeah, you raise a great point. We often talk about housing and remove income from the equation. When incomes don't rise, nothing is ever affordable. And so what we need to do, and in San Francisco in particular, you have very high incomes in a certain segment of the population, and you have income stagnation among other parts. If you're working in the tech sector, life is good. You can, quote unquote, afford that $1 million, 1,500 square foot home. If you are a teacher, a nurse, or a service worker, you simply can't afford it. And on top of that, the housing markets are constrained by single family zoning ordinances. And so, again, we need to change the ordinances. We need to make sure that everyday workers can afford to work and live in the same area. And we need to just increase supply. I mean, those are some heavy lifts. It sounds simple. Those are some heavy lifts, but it can be done. And we have had these kind of innovations in the 30s, with one major exception, that we increase the number of homeowners for white people, not necessarily for all. And so we need to go back to those kind of bold initiatives, but without the discriminatory aspects of it.
Do you see either candidate's policies addressing this and helping equalize this and have the Black community, so to speak, catch up?
I think both candidates have talked about increasing housing supply. I think where the rub is, the Republican candidates, at least some of the messaging that I've seen, somewhat supports the single family zoning ordinances and talks about, Trump infamously talked about their invading the suburbs and the like. And so in that respect, you can't have it both ways. You can't say we're going to increase supply and not change the single family zoning ordinances that constrain it. And so I think in this regard, the Harris candidacy is more in line with what we need. Certainly, she does talk about increasing supply. She does talk about providing down payment assistance. So I think the targets are there, but I also think both candidates are talking about increased supply, but one is simply not addressing the constraining factors that go into that.
Andre Perry, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
The CEO of messaging app Telegram, Pavel Durov, has officially been charged with a wide range of crimes related to enabling so-called illegal activity on the app. He was also barred from leaving France pending further investigation. If convicted, Durov's sentence could be up to 10 years in prison. Now, to be specific, the French authorities have charged Durov with alleged complicity in crimes including drug trafficking, fraud, the distribution of child pornography, refusing to cooperate with law enforcement. The Paris prosecutor said Durov was ordered to pay bail of 5 million euros. He was released from custody, but still must check in at a police station twice a week. The prosecutor also reiterated Telegram has played a role, she says, in multiple criminal cases in France tied to child sexual abuse, online hate crimes, and drug trafficking, and has shown a, quote, near total absence of response to requests for law enforcement cooperation. She added that legal authorities in other European countries have shared the same observation. Durov's lawyers say to French media, quote, it's totally absurd to think the person in charge of a social network could be implicated in criminal acts that don't concern him directly or indirectly. And this, I have to say, really goes to the fundamental disconnect between Europe and the U.S. that I talked about a little bit in my radar today, Jessica. This is exactly why we have Section 230 in the U.S. People should watch my radar today if they didn't watch it, but Section 230, which is what the Biden administration threatened to take away from social media companies if they did not police COVID speech more aggressively, is the statute that makes it so the platform itself, the owner of the platform, the company, is not liable for the speech on the platform. You're liable for it if it's your speech, but if you just own the platform, you're not liable. So we have that in the U.S., Europe does not have that, and so here they are trying to hold the CEO, the founder, the creator, accountable in the event that there was illicit activity going on the platform. And I think this is a very bad move, a very slippery slope. Certainly, they can require, as we do in the U.S., the platforms to do more to combat sexual misconduct, underage sexual activity, terrorist activity, and that kind of thing. But that's what they say they're trying to get him for, of complicity in that, again, for just owning the platform where it takes place. That stuff takes place on Facebook too. It takes place on other social media apps. The social media apps do communicate with law enforcement to flag those things. The real issue is wanting to, grapple with the fact that Telegram is going to allow misinformation and hate speech, which the European authorities no longer want.
Yeah, I do appreciate that in Europe, you're not in a situation where you're constantly monitored with an ankle bracelet. Going in and checking in with the police twice a week sounds egregious, but when you realize that the ankle monitor is kind of like being in prison when you're living your regular life in the US, that practice, I think, is much more regressive than checking in. The reason he's committed a crime aside, just that practice of how they monitor people that they deem to be dangerous, I think checking in with, the police, going to the police station and not constantly being watched or listened to or tracked with a monitor is much better psychologically when we think about what kind of impact that has on people. James Kilgore writes a lot about it, is an activist around that. This seems better than that. Of course, the reason he is in prison seems a little bit, or the reason he's being, on probation, checking in with the French authorities twice a week, not so good. That he's, found to be responsible for crimes that other people committed, and that somehow he has to be a police force and be the CEO of this company that's used for communications. What is he supposed to do now? The app's whole thing is they guarantee private encrypted messaging. Now he has to read them all to check for crimes. Now no one's going to use Telegram in France. It negates its original purpose because while the French love to protest, and that's what I use Telegram for, there are other people who just want no one reading their messages, who are not doing anything nefarious or illegal. It is sad, but I think there's a better way to do this. And that's what's lacking here, is there was no mediation process for, maybe we implement some kind of computer program that web scrapes messages. There's a disclosure to users. If you're using X, Y, and Z words, you're not allowed to use the app, but they could come up with code words like many criminals do when they talk about, drug deals. I'm sure this is common in the ring of people who are, doing pedophilia or making exchanges online, but there has to be something, some kind of happy medium between this CEO is now responsible for everyone's crimes instead of just investigating the crimes being committed and getting the actual criminals. And you know what? We're allowed to just do crimes secretly as long as we use certain apps. There has to be something in between.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think Glenn Greenwald made an excellent point on his show the other day when he was talking about this. He said, look, if you can, put in prison the owner of the platform because you don't think he cooperated in your investigation enough, I mean, that gives tremendous power to the bureaucrats, to the state, to to encourage the platforms to just censor more of the kind of content they want because they don't want to run they don't want to be looked at sideways, be looked at funny by the state. So it's going to make them. It's going to implicitly send a signal to them that, if they want to not find themselves on the wrongful side of what I would say is a BS prosecution like this, they better, listen when Terry Breton says, hey, are you policing your site for misinformation? We're looking into this. Free speech is all good and everything, but we think there's a lot of hate speech going on about this Trump character. You might say, okay, yeah, we're going to take that really seriously. We're going to take stuff down because you don't want to be investigated for facilitating child pornography, terrorism, because that's what they can do if they think you're not falling in line with their censorship agenda. So it gives more ability to enforce censorship on the platform, and I think that's really the bigger issue. Yes, I agree there needs to be some involvement of law enforcement on actual criminal stuff like violence and underage sexual materials. We have that in the U.S. Despite Section 230, there's requirements to police that kind of thing. We have copyright law, for instance. Like you can get the platform can get a notification that there's a copyright violation, and they have a certain amount of time to take that down before they become liable. It's not every instance they're instantly responsible for it. They get a takedown period. That's how copyright law generally works, and it actually ends up working pretty well. I think something like that might be a good model for the limited number of areas where we do think there ought to be more policing consistent with free speech understanding or a First Amendment understanding. But this just goes so far and raises the possibility of a dissident, essentially. Someone who fled Russia, someone who is not pro-Vladimir Putin, who thought Russia's authoritarianism was something to escape, ends up getting arrested in France, in the bastion of the Enlightenment, the country of Voltaire, the country that helped invent the free speech understanding on which so much of the West did operate, that is fundamentally baked into the American Revolution and the U.S., the DNA of this country. We inherited it from them, and now they're turning their back on it.
Yeah, I will say Europe and the EU, they don't mess around. Even Interpol, they don't mess around when it comes to any pedophilia, any child pornography. When I was working doing data-driven policy research in policy labs, we worked with a lot of, really skilled computer scientists and data scientists, and they would hack into these live streams that were run by people doing just awful things, live child pornography, because it's less easy to track the files if it's run live on the deep web, and they would hack into and find the location of these people live, and Interpol would come and arrest them. That's all to say they have the technology needed if they really had to say, Telegram, we're going to need to get in here and find people doing X, Y, and Z thing. This is not covered by free speech if you're doing this kind of awful crime. I'm sure the CEO would play ball. And the fact that they're using the reality that the app is used for people committing crimes, doing the worst crimes possible, to just attack the CEO in an effort to, have Telegram be taken down, not be as accessible, not be as encrypted. I think it becomes a free speech concern. It initiates as this unreasonable search and seizure or holding someone responsible for someone else's crimes, but it seems like a free speech thing. I think that they could have worked this out in a way where they worked with the CEO of Telegram to investigate those crimes, because the majority of the people using the app are people using it to organize, people who are not committing crimes, people who are protesters that don't want to be tracked in some way, people who have a high risk of being hacked, reporters getting information, and they want to protect their sources and their sources' identities. There's all kinds of positive reasons to use an app like Telegram. But to take it down because that kind of reporting or that kind of protesting is inconvenient for governments like France, That's where it becomes a free speech concern for me, even though it initiates, as in the United States, a Fourth Amendment concern. And so there has to be a happy medium that's struck in other countries. And I think France will be an example of an extreme scenario that should not be replicated.
More Rising right after this. Taxes are an issue at the heart of the 2024 presidential election, and this week CNBC squawked at Kamala Harris's economic advisors Barrett Ramos for arguing in favor of an unrealized capital gains tax, taxes on things like real estate and property.
I bet that the majority of people watching right now are already paying a tax on unrealized gains. It's called a property tax.
Property tax.
When the value of your home goes up,
That's an old.
It's a use
That's
tax.
an old.
when the value of your
paying
home
for
goes up,
schools.
you pay
It's
higher
tiring.
taxes even if
And
you
it
don't sell
doesn't
your
go,
home.
your value of your home never moves the way
Not the
a stock
same.
moves, the way something
That's always
else
the
moves that you
go-to
don't sell.
answer.
It's also, property tax is a use tax. You're paying for for the schools, you're paying for emergency services. Those are things that make absolute sense.
And sure, and all the revenue that comes in from these unrealized gains taxes and the other taxes in the Harris plan are going to go to creating what she calls more opportunity. It's to make sure
But
that
it's not
every
a use
newborn
tax
born
for
in
the
this
people who
country
are actually
gets
using
$6,000.
using the services.
And it was never in anyone's intent to
It's not income.
tax.
It's not an income tax.
And
if
it's
you're
never
taxing
gonna
on realized
happen.
gain.
What do you think's going on here, Jessica?
Well, there are a lot of very wealthy people who have a lot of unrealized capital gains. They, use this as collateral to take out loans. So it essentially acts as liquid cash for a lot of very wealthy people. Let's say you have $1 million in investments, it's property, it's stock, etc. You can leverage that and get a loan from the bank at the equivalent of $1 million. And so for a lot of people, this acts as money. It acts as liquid capital in that way. And so taxing it is almost necessary with these folks. Now, what Kamala Harris is proposing is not radical. The current capital gain structure is you pay 0% up to $50,000. From $50,000 to $500,000, it's 15%. From $500,000 and above, you're currently paying 20%. That's all the same as it is now today. What Kamala Harris and the White House is proposing changing is that for anyone who has $1 million and more of unrealized capital gains, or rather capital gains, money they've made off of money they already have, that's 39.6%. And if you're a billionaire, it's going to go up on unrealized capital gains for 44.6, any dollar over $1 million. So the way this manifests, let's say if you have a house, you sell it for $100,000, you're only paying 15% on every dollar over that 50,000. So the actual real rate of $100,000 in capital gains would be 7.5, not 15%. And so a lot of people are fear-mongering, saying this is a huge increase. This is going to affect working class and middle class people. Nothing's going to change for working class and middle class people. If you're a billionaire or a millionaire, you might be upset, but at the end of the day, it's a popular policy issue to have the very wealthy paying their fair share in taxes.
More and more. Yeah, I don't know. I think she should loudly proclaim that, and we'll see what people think. But people, paying more money on these kinds of, not directly tangible assets doesn't seem like it's going to be popular with. I mean, it's not just millionaires and billionaires who have who fall into this category, right? It's people who engage in the stock market, which is a much wider swath of people. And, here they are already paying property taxes, already paying income taxes, already paying sales taxes, already paying taxes on all sorts of things for all sorts of services. And now Kamala Harris wants to come in and extort more money out of them. I don't know how popular that's going to end up being, even if it doesn't touch the people on the lower end of the economic distribution. Not that I don't want them to pay anymore. I don't want anyone to pay more in taxes. I want more people, no matter how rich or poor you are, to keep more of your money. It's your money. You earned it. You should decide what to do with it. And a lot of people don't like how the government ends up spending their money, not just to enrich their community or pay for their school system, but on an unwieldy federal bureaucracy, on a inefficient health system and everything, and entitlement system and military spending and all of that. I think it would be better if we constrain the government and let people keep more of their money.
Well, I think because it's popular among the American people to tax the very wealthy, and usually when this polling question is asked, that's defined as people earning over $400,000 or more. This is only applying to people with specifically over $1 million in capital gains. So they're making over $1 million on money they have invested. So you have to be like a multimillionaire for this policy to even affect you, to even touch you. Because as I said, all of the other, metrics are exactly the same. 0% up to $50,000, only 15% from 50 to 500,000, and 20% over 500K. That's all how it exists today. The only raising is on people with over $1 million in capital gains. And that metric goes up to the 44.6% from 39.6% if you are a billionaire, if you have over $1 billion in wealth. So I think that, even if you look at, let's say someone has a large retirement account or big investment property, their capital gains is going to be $525,000. The real actual amount of money they're paying is not going to be 20% of 500,000. It's going to only be 20% on that 25,000 that exceeds 500K. So the total amount of money they would pay in taxes on 525,000 in capital gains is $72,500, which is a real rate of 13.8%. And so I think there's a lot of fear mongering going around with the sticker shock. Ben Shapiro made a video saying, oh my God, we're all going to have to pay, 44% in taxes. No, only the very, very wealthy will be paying that.
Well, we'll have to see how this plan goes over with the Americans. Maybe Kamala will be asked about it in this upcoming interview she's going to do tonight, I believe, with CNN, her and Tim Walz. Obviously, I've criticized her for being light on policy pronouncements so far, although then when she actually does propose a policy, it's inevitably one I don't particularly care for. Obviously the rich should pay their fair share, although, who determines what's the fair share for how much of someone else's money should be confiscated by the government? But maybe that's just the cranky libertarian in me. I mean, they pay obviously in real terms far more dollars than anyone else. It's you can say, well, it doesn't matter as much to them because they have so much money. But I think the individual is, for the most part, the best at understanding how to spend one's own money rather than some distant, vast federal bureaucracy that spends money on all sorts of things I don't think it should be spending money on. But we'll have to see if this becomes reality under a future Harris administration.
Yes, I think that the way I think about it is we look at what incomes have looked like across the economy. We look at the regular average worker getting paid less and less over time and wages stagnating despite productivity increasing since the 1970s, about inflation adjusted. We look at what the minimum wage is worth today in purchasing power because prices have gone up, and we see that it's worth much less than it was worth in 1968. Over 30% less in purchasing power is what you're getting on a minimum wage annual income in the United States. Why? We've seen corporate profits increase exponentially. So the money made off of workers being infinitely more productive is all going to the top. So how do we equalize that? If they're keeping wages low and keeping prices high and squeezing workers from both sides, you've got to do something to equalize the amount of income in the economy. Because what we've seen is basically the wealthy reverse Robin Hooding the working class, stealing from the poor and giving to the rich. And a lot of these people that are having over $1 million in capital gains annually are not working. They're just turning their money into more money. How? The money is invested in rental properties and in America's largest corporations, which again are bringing in money off of the backs of working people and not giving them their fair share. And so should you be able to earn $1 million off of other people's work who are struggling to get by when you sit on your butt? I think that's not the American way. And I think that's why this is going to ultimately become a popular policy once they break through a lot of the misinformation about how the tax structure works and really how the economic setup is, that this is not taking money from regular working people. It's actually going to help set things right.
More Rising right after this. United Airlines flight attendants voted to authorize a strike Wednesday, but a walkout may not happen. For context, the United Airlines fleet is demanding a double-digit base pay increase, pay for time at work on the ground, retroactive pay, schedule flexibility, and work rule improvements, job security, retirement, and more.
Now, this is where it gets sticky. United flight attendants filed for federal mediation over 8 months ago and have been working under an amenable contract for nearly 3 years. So, if they want to go forward with the strike, flight attendants would need to get a release from the talks with management. So, will they walk off the job or not? Here to dive in further is Ken Diaz, president of the United chapter of the Association of Flight Attendants. Welcome, Ken.
Thank you for having me.
So help us understand this overwhelming decision to strike and what's really at stake here.
Well, United flight attendants have been in negotiations for 3 years with management. We've made very minimal progress. I would say that we've only agreed to about 20% of our entire contract. It's been stalled, and that's why we applied for federal mediation. We've been in talks with the mediator for 6 months. We started in March. We have not come to any agreements in these 6 months. And flight attendants are working without having a raise in the last 3 years. We helped this airline through the pandemic. The government helped this airline industry survive. And yet flight attendants are still left with nothing. I mean, we have new hire flight attendants that can't afford to pay rent, that are living in cars. And I say that seriously because it is actually happening. I mean, the average new hire flight attendant makes $23,000, and they can't survive on that. So we are trying to get improvements for our flight attendants. And United is making billions of dollars in profits. And they are giving exorbitant millions of dollars to the executives. And here we are 3 years later, making no progress in these negotiations. And that's why we called for a strike vote. And quite frankly, it was overwhelming. It was 99.99%, with over 90% of our flight attendants taking part in this vote. And that sends a clear message that we're united in, and we want this airline to be successful. We want it to be a world-class airline, but not with leaving flight attendants behind.
Yeah, you can't be a world-class airline leaving flight attendants behind
No.
with the amount of legs that they run. Help us understand how much, the working conditions, what are the flight attendants dealing with that they're negotiating for that management isn't budging on?
So obviously, wages are, United knows what the wages are in the industry. So they have promised us industry-leading wages. They have not proposed industry-leading wages to us. We're trying to find work-life balance with flexibility for flight attendants so that our families are just as important than anyone else's families. And the time that we're away from our families is tremendous. I mean, United Airlines, sometimes, I don't know if the traveling public realizes, we don't get paid until that aircraft pushes back from the gate. And then the pay stops when we come back and we land and we come to the gate. The time that we spend at work, doing our safety checks, during boarding, in between flights, we're not compensated our hourly wages during that time. And we're trying to seek improvements to our retirement security. Many of us lost our pensions during the bankruptcy in 2005. And we're trying to negotiate better working conditions for our flight attendants. The amazing thing, and this is the third negotiations I've ever been involved with, the amazing part of these negotiations are every single proposal that comes across the table from United Airlines is asking us for concessions. This isn't concessionary bargaining. This airline is making millions, and it's time for improvements, just as we're seeing across the industry. American Airlines flight attendants, Southwest Airlines flight attendants, Alaska Airlines flight attendants, even though they voted down their tentative agreement just a few weeks ago by a 2-to-1 margin, we're seeking the same improvements that the rest of the industry has gotten. We've seen what the pilot groups have gotten, and we're not willing to go for concessions just to get a raise. We're not going to pay for our raise. That's not an improvement for United flight attendants.
Absolutely. I think about flight attendants. I fly a lot. A lot of the times, the person who is the desk agent announcing the flight is the same person doing the service on the flight. These are people who are the public face of the company in many ways and are dealing with customers' most complicated problems, trying to get from A to B. It's a taxing job, and this idea that seemingly people who are doing the most work, the most labor in our economy, are making the least. It's a consistent problem. And I think a lot of workers can get hope from seeing, United Airlines flight attendants willing to strike for, what is basic working condition improvements when they deserve a lot more than even what they're asking for. So how do you see this as a part of, the larger fight for labor? Are you seeing more support for strikes and less people saying, oh no, well, it's going to be hard to fly because of the flight attendants, and instead saying, well, United had 3 years to fix this problem. This strike is really the company's issue.
Yeah, I mean, the detriment that we have as flight attendants, we work under the Railway Labor Act, so we work under different conditions than other labor unions in the country, that we don't get the ability to strike when our contract is due. It just becomes amenable. And the corporations in the airline industry have used that to delay, because every month and year that they delay, they're saving money, but we're losing money. And I believe in the larger labor movement. What you're seeing across the country is labor is speaking up with one voice now, that corporations are so greedy that they're forgetting that it is the frontline employees of all of these different industries that bring in the profits to these corporations, and the workers want to share in those profits. And I don't think we're asking for unreasonable things. I think we've earned it. We've helped save this airline many times through bankruptcy, through concessions during bankruptcy, through the pandemic, when this airline industry didn't know who was going to survive. The government gave money. We lobbied the government to help these airlines survive the pandemic. And now we're just like tossed aside like we're nothing. And flight attendants, I mean, it's resounding that you can get that percentage of flight attendants saying, if we have to strike, that we will. We don't want to. We absolutely don't want to. But we do want United Airlines to get serious and negotiate the improvements that United flight attendants deserve.
We're seeing safety become an increasingly common issue for airlines and flight attendants and airline workers, especially with what we saw happen with the Boeing 757 wheel exploding at Delta, taking 2 workers' lives. How much are safety concerns a part of these negotiations among, the flight attendants?
Safety concerns are very, very high on our list. We are safety professionals. I mean, we have 9/11 coming up. People can't forget that, it was flight attendants that were the first to die on that day. I had family members on that day. So we're working in an industry where safety has to be paramount. Our passengers have to feel safe. Our crews have to feel safe when they come on board those aircraft. And that's why we're very, very involved in talks with the company regarding safety. We're keeping apprised of what's going on with the Boeing situation, and safety is paramount to our job, because let's face it, we have to know that we're safe. We're in a safe aircraft so that our passengers can feel safe flying with us.
Thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken. I will add, any safety that's fought for by these airline workers is safety that passengers will enjoy as well. So we appreciate your work, Ken. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yelp appears to be leaning heavily into a court's ruling earlier this month that Google had violated antitrust laws. The go-to site for crowdsourced reviews about businesses, Yelp is now suing Google, filed suit on Wednesday, alleging that the tech giant's self-preferencing its own product to dominate local search and advertising markets is anti-competitive.
As Axios reports, Yelp's lawsuit has been a long time coming. The crowdsource app has persistently claimed that Google limits consumer choice and has anti-competitive conduct. And it's lobbied federal and local government officials to boost oversight of Google's potential antitrust violations. The tech giant pushed back, telling Axios and other outlets, quote, Yelp's claims are not new. Similar claims were thrown out years ago by the FTC and recently by the judge in the DOJ's case. Google will vigorously defend against Yelp's meritless claims. So we'll see about that. Potentially, there's more evidence that has come out since the last time this was reviewed by the FTC. And I think that at the end of the day, when you're trying to manipulate the amount of information a consumer has to make a decision to favor your products, that's what a lot of economists call a market failure. And that's the kind of, even the most conservative Chicago economists, that's the kind of thing they would say, this is time to regulate. This is a market failure with this information asymmetry between sellers and consumers.
For a company to preference its own product or to try to keep people using it. The foundation of antitrust, this is the problem for a lot of the very pro-antitrust people in both progressive circles and to some degree on the right, is that the kind of our legal tradition has taken the position that the basis of antitrust is harm to the consumer. And a lot of this stuff targeting tech companies is about anti-competitive behavior harming rival firms without presenting much evidence of harm to the consumer. I mean, you and I argued about this decision a couple weeks ago, the unfavorable decision to Google, based part on the fact that it's the default search engine on Apple products, and they were calling that deal corrupt. But to my mind, it follows public preference, right? There's not widespread evidence consumers want some other product. If they did, it'd be possible to use it. In fact, the government seems to be intervening to say, you all really like using Google a lot, but we're not comfortable with that because it's made Google too big and powerful. So we want to force on you some other options, even though the clear consumer preference is for Google. And I'm seeing some of that here. Like, what is Google's obligation to prop up Yelp and make it a successful rival company for determining what reviews are good? I mean, like, Yelp might be better and people might prefer Yelp, but I don't know why it should be Google's responsibility to advertise, like, I don't have to sit here and say, like, everyone should go watch Breaking Points now. Check out Breaking Point. Like, that would make no sense. Is that anti-competitive if I'd rather have you watching my show? I just don't buy it.
I think the market's good for consumers when you give a better product, and that's the incentive people have to purchase it. Or in the case of using online apps, you're giving, ad revenue in exchange for your use of the platform. But in Google's case, that was just decided by that federal judge. I think it was a good decision based on the damning evidence that it's not that Google outcompeted other search engines. It's that they used their capital, the money they had on hand, to purchase being the default app by just straight up giving money to Apple and Samsung and saying, make us the default search engine. And they've made it very difficult for any user to figure out how to make a different search engine the default when they try and figure out, X, Y, or Z on the web. And I think that deliberate purchasing and not outcompeting other search engines is, antitrust. It's an antitrust concern. It's anti-competitive behavior. You're not even giving consumers the option to say, well, this other app is better. You're just purchasing access to consumers. You're purchasing a share of the market. And so it's assumed that that is bad for consumers because we live in the basis that competition is what produces better outcomes, better products and goods and services for consumers to go on to purchase. And so eliminating competition, we assume, is a problem. And I think any indication that it's not a problem is just, at that point, we don't have a market society. We have a government that allows for the largest corporations to control entire industries. And that's just something that goes against fundamental ideals of, freedom and market competition that are very dear to many Americans. So the reason for that is, precisely this: Google crowding out other companies, forcing their products on people. We don't even get to see the alternative. We're deprived of a free choice there.
I mean, people, you can use the alternatives. People just don't because they suck compared to Google. People prefer Google. If the government came in and said that Google was no longer allowed to pay Apple in order to be the default search engine on iPhones, and so it was no longer the default app, what would happen, right? Millions of people would be like, WTF, I would like Google. How do I put Google back on my phone? What they'd find out is that Apple has to do it, is that they do it for free because it's what people want. You say that this is like anti-competitive. I just see a firm winning in the marketplace, and now government coming in and say, oh no, you won too much. That's not fair. We don't like that. Even though there's no evidence that any large number of people have any problem with that. So I see government intervening in private market transactions that are not harming consumers whatsoever. They might be harming rival search engines or rival reviewer sites, but again, I don't think there should be a legal obligation to preference your competitors or to give your competitors equal time and attention on your own platform. Frankly, it doesn't make any sense to me. And there's no evidence it's doing anyone who actually uses the products harm. And you can use Yelp. Like none of this is being. If Google was lobbying for a law to make Yelp illegal, that would be different. But again, that would be using not the markets, but the government force. If you take the government force out of it, it's market competition. One product is winning, another could win at some other time. It'll be responsive to customer demand. I mean, the tech industry is where there's more creative destruction, more dramatic rises and falls than any other sector of our economy, right? Things change dramatically over time. Which tech companies, which platforms, which sites are the popular ones, the ones doing really well, the ones that seem dominant? How many times it seem like a monopoly, and then the next day they lose it. They're nothing. So I just don't have any. I don't see a need for a government to really butt in here.
I mean, I think a big reason for why people see Google as the only search engine is precisely because they control 90% of the market, and they secured this share of the market through a multi-billion-dollar deal with these cell phone providers. I think a lot of people, if they were exposed to other search engines, but if they just go to the search bar on their phone and type in a question, it automatically goes to Google. They haven't had the opportunity to experience other search engines. A lot of these people haven't. DuckDuckGo or Bing or Yahoo News. I remember being a kid when there was a lot less consolidation than what we see today. And a big part of this is the prominence of smartphones and cell phones and your Apple laptop, that when you search up any question that you have or query online, it's going to take you to a Google search. So this one major company controls 90% of what people find when they go looking for anything on the internet, something to purchase, an answer to a question. That is way too much power for one group to have. And so that's, I think, the main concern, is that they control our access to information and our access to products. There's a world where Google could manipulate a lot of the commerce in the country, a lot of the information access in the country. And we just don't want to be in a scenario like we were when there was a huge outage in the software used by a lot of major airlines, when Microsoft had that one line of code that caused so many planes to be grounded. That's what happens when we have the over-reliance on one provider or one company for something that is widely relied upon airlines across the economy, upon companies that relied on that Microsoft server as their interface to interact with their coworkers at work or in their work from home environment on their laptop. And so this over-reliance creates a lot of economic insecurities that can, like it did when we had that Microsoft server go down because of one line of code, that causes extreme economic consequences. What did productivity look like as a result of that failure of just one company? And so I think diversity is good, not just because it's good for consumers, but also because it's kind of a free speech concern. It's kind of an access to information concern as well.
Well, I don't know. I might argue the free speech concern is going the other way, right? Is the Google wants to use its speech, Apple wants to use its speech, and this is Yelp coming in and saying we don't like how they're using their speech and we want the government to intervene. But it's an interesting issue. You, the viewers, let us know in the comments what you think about it. That does it for us today on Rising. It was great being with you this week. Jessica, my arm is already feeling a little bit better. I think it's not as serious an injury as we were worried. Thank you to the control room and my production team for taking good care of me as I stumbled into the studio with a injury today. But
take it easy, Robbie. It might be the painkillers kicking in, not that you magically healed within the past hour. You got to heal yourself.
Okay, we'll see. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe so you never miss any content. And for those of you who like to listen while on the go, now available anywhere you can find podcasts. See you later.
Bye, y'all.